Today on Lead Well, I want to talk about the fact that leaders are relational. By that I mean that leaders care about people. Whether you're leading in your home, with your children, at church, in your workplace, you're going to be leading people. And it's really important for us to remember that for better or worse, people aren't robots. They don't always do the things we think they will. Sometimes they disappoint us, sometimes they surprise us, sometimes they hurt us, sometimes they do things to help us. That when we lead people. The greatest basketball coach to ever coach in the history of basketball, Coach John Calipari, always says about his players, we have to remember, guys, that these are students, that these are young men, that they're not robots. So when they miss a free throw or they don't play defense or they don't box out, it's not because they're bad people, it's just because they're people, they're human beings. And oftentimes, when we lead, whether in the home or in the church or in the workplace, we forget that we're leading people and we expect people to be robots. We expect them to always be consistent, to always do what we expect, and to always listen to us or to always follow our lead and to never mess up. And that's just not the world that we live in. We live in a broken world with broken people, and that includes us. So no matter where you're leading as a sinner, leading other sinful, broken people. And so it's important for us to remember that leaders care about people. They care about relationships. That sometimes we can get sidetracked and begin to care more about tasks, more about getting things done than we actually do about people. Good leaders care about both and understand that getting things done and caring about people don't have to be at odds with each other. I think about even just the ministry of Jesus and how patient that Jesus was with his disciples. We would say that Jesus got a lot done in his ministry. He accomplished all that the Father gave him to do, and yet he was saddled with these 12 guys who couldn't seem to get out of their own way. You think about John 4, for instance, when they go to get food and to bring it back to Jesus. Jesus has this whole conversation with the woman at the well, and the disciples are so clueless, they come back, and Jesus says, I've got food that no one else knows about, food from my Father. And what's the disciples' response? They sort of think, well, I thought you sent us to get lunch. Did somebody else bring him lunch? Where did Jesus get his food from? They are clueless. As Jesus is marching to Jerusalem on the way to this death and burial and resurrection, what are the disciples doing? They're arguing about who is the greatest and who's going to sit on his right and his left. As we see in the Gospels again and again and again, the disciples miss it, that they are inconsistent. One moment you have Peter confessing that Jesus is the Christ. The next moment you have Peter trying to talk him out of going to the cross. That we see that they often fail Jesus. And yet what do we see out of Jesus in relationship to them? Patience and kindness and loving care. He corrects them, he rebukes them, and yet he's also kind and patient with them. That we have in Jesus a perfect model of what it looks like to lead people. That Jesus wasn't leading 12 robots, that Jesus was leading 12 sinful men, and he did it perfectly. That when we lead people, I think about this often in my own family. I've got a wife, I've got 2 young kids. I have to remember that, especially with my kids, that they're human beings. And so sometimes I'll catch myself saying to them, well, I can't believe you did that. Or what were you thinking? And then I have to sort of step back and be reminded, well, they're sinners, and I'm a sinner, and I've done the same sort of things in my life. And we don't always make consistent logical choices. Sometimes we're inconsistent people. We do things that we ought not do. We do things even sometimes that we don't want to do. This is what Paul's talking about in Romans 7. And so I have to remember this even in relationship to my own family, as I'm encouraged to lead them with kindness and with patience. So a few things I want to encourage you to do as you lead in the home or at church or in your family, as you seek to lead relationally, to lead with a care for people above everything else. So one, I would tell you, don't place tasks above people. The two don't have to be at odds with each other. That don't steamroll people, don't destroy relationships simply to get things done. People matter. At the end of the day, no matter where you're leading, these people, these relationships matter. That these are people made in the image of God who have an eternal destiny. We ought to care about everybody that's around us, especially those that are put under our care if we're in leadership over them. So don't place tasks over people. Instead, value people over tasks. In the long term, it so much more honors God to care about people than to care about getting things done. At the end of your life, you're not going to think back to all the checklists that you accomplished. You're often going to think about the relationships that you cultivated and the ways in which you use the relationships that God put in your sphere in order to glorify and honor him. So, number one, don't put task over people, but instead value people over task. 2, lean into grace. We always want people to show grace to us when we mess up, when we are inconsistent, when we fail, when we do the wrong thing. We want people to show grace to us. And yet often when we're in positions of leadership, when other people who we're leading fail, when they mess up, when they're inconsistent, we don't want to show grace. We want to show justice. We want judgment to come. We want to always have to point out their wrongdoing and tell them why they should do it better. But I think that the default position for Christians ought to be one of grace, that we lead into grace. We've been shown much grace, that we ought to be humble and show grace to other people. It doesn't mean that there's no place for rebuke, that there's no place for correction. We see Jesus rebuke and correct the disciples. What it does mean is we do so with a gracious spirit, understanding that we have been forgiven much, that God has been gracious to us. So our demeanor towards other people, especially those people that we lead, ought to be one of grace and of mercy. So value people over tasks, lean hard into grace, and default to empathy. I think often when we think about empathy, I think it means that we always have to understand what the other people, what somebody else is feeling. That's not what empathy is. Empathy isn't always completely understanding how somebody else is feeling or understanding all of their circumstances or life experiences. It's just attempting to. Empathy says, even though I may not know all that you've gone through, I'm going to seek to try to understand things from your perspective. That it means that I'm going to have compassion, understanding that maybe you're different than me. So it means that as leaders, we understand that the people that we lead are all going to be built differently. They've had different life experiences, they have different personalities, they have different skills, they have different gifts that God has given them, and we want to lead with empathy. We want to consider their point of view and not simply force everybody into our point of view in the way in which we see the world, or we see often it's just the completion of a task that we want people to go about it our way. So we're leading with grace when people make mistakes, and we're leading with empathy, that we want to empathize with people, see things from their perspective, and sometimes that allows us to show more grace as we see, maybe we understand why they made that mistake, or we understand why they were inconsistent in this area, partly because we know that we make mistakes, that we're often inconsistent, that we don't always do what we should and don't always do what we say we will. So we value people over task. We lean hard into grace. We want to show grace to people, and we always default to empathy. We want to care about people and where they come from and try to see the world from their perspective. And then ultimately in all this, we're seeking to point people to Jesus. No matter where you're leading, church, home, work, community, it doesn't matter where you're leading. As a Christian, your ultimate goal is not to raise profits in the next quarter, is not to accomplish this task, is not to bolster your resumes, not to, as a parent, produce good, upstanding members of society. Your ultimate goal as a Christian in all things is to honor God and to point people to Christ. And so, as a husband, as a father, as a pastor, my ultimate job is to point people to Jesus. And I ought to do that with the way that I lead. So always have that in your mind. As a parent, your job is to point your children to Jesus. As a boss, your job is to point your employees to Jesus. As a leader in the church, whether you're a Sunday school teacher, or you're a deacon, or you're a pastor, your job is to point people to Jesus. So more than accomplishing tasks, you want people to see Christ. And so think, how can I, in my relationship with people, be so marked by the characteristics of Christ? Conviction, humility, compassion, empathy, humbleness. Right? How can I be so marked by the characteristics of Christ that when people see me, when they're led by me, that my leadership reflects the character of Jesus so that they're pointed to Him? More than anything else, at the end of my life, I want people who interacted with me be reminded of Jesus by their interactions with me, that's what sticks more than anything that I've accomplished, more than anything on my resume, more than any task that get done. I want people who know me and know my life to say, He reminded us of Christ. He pointed us in all things to Jesus. This is why leadership is relational, that it's about people, because the world is relational. It is about people, that Jesus cared about people. We too ought to care about people.